What's the thing that has the most leverage when we're trying to deal with uncertainty?
Yeah, the biggest role or biggest thing we have to understand when dealing with uncertainty is to quite literally keep our frontal lobe engaged. So our brain, we have a few parts of our brain, right? But the main parts we know about are our frontal lobe, which is our conscious thinking logical mind, right? And then we have our limbic brain, which is known as our lizard brain, which is our emotional center and actually takes care of a bulk of our daily functions. What happens when we begin to feel stressed and kind of dive into uncertainty? So stress and fear begin to rise in our system, is that as our autonomic arousal goes up, our frontal lobe actually begins to start to take a back seat to our limbic brain. And in the extreme cases, this is called amygdala hijack or autonomic overload. And what happens there is your frontal lobe has literally taken a back seat and your limbic brain is now front and center and you are acting without thinking. Now, this comes in very handy when we're jumping out of the way of a moving train or running from a bear. But in 99.9% of uncertain and stressful environments, we want to actually be able to engage our conscious thought processes. So what we have to be focused on is what are those things we can do to get our frontal lobe back online and begin to logically think through our situation. And the techniques and the things, and I know we'll get into a lot of it, that I talk about in the book really are centered around that concept.
I know that breathing has to play a big role. I mean, like getting us back into parasympathetic and allowing ourselves to be able to feel like we have some sense of control, even if the environment isn't necessarily under control.
Yeah.
What are some of those things or tactics that we can do? The 2-minute rule is a big one. Other things that we can do to allow ourselves to feel like we have more certainty, even if we're in an uncertain position.
Yeah, so there's a couple ways we want to think about this. So there's the well, let me back up. So a good friend of mine, you've seen the book. A good friend of mine is Andrew Huberman. Andrew and I have been working together quite a long time, and one of the things we came up with or really decided upon was this idea that fear is a combination of anxiety plus uncertainty. Okay, so in other words, you can be uncertain without being anxious. Or let me start with, you could be anxious without being uncertain. So that's like I have a presentation to give next week, but I know the presentation, I know the people I'm giving to. So I'm a little anxious, but I'm not uncertain. There's nothing uncertain about it.
Mm-hmm.
You can be uncertain without being anxious. So, well, that's every kid on Christmas Eve. Okay, there's no fear there. Okay,
Right.
Once you start to combine the two, fear starts to present itself, and that's when our autonomic arousal goes up, our amygdala gets tickled, so on and so forth. Now, the idea is you can actually buy down either one of those. You can buy down anxiety or it can buy down uncertainty. One of the first things we have to think about is buying down anxiety, because anxiety is an internal response. That's our autonomic arousal going up. That's where breathing techniques come in handy, because breathing techniques will literally begin to calm our system, take us from sympathetic. It might not even take us from sympathetic to parasympathetic, but it'll certainly decrease our autonomic arousal, get that frontal lobe back online. Okay, that's us buying down the internal physiological response that is anxiety. To buy down uncertainty, now that uncertainty is always external to us. That's what we have to understand. We have to be able to actually interrogate our environment in a specific way. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is this idea that our brains are constantly trying to parse any environment or situation along three mediums. Those mediums are duration, how long is it going to last? Pathway, our route in or out, and then outcome, what's waiting at the end. If we are in absence of one or more of those things, that's when we feel uncertainty rising into our system. And so one of the ways that we grasp or can grasp onto certainty or make certain an uncertain environment is to create our own duration, pathway, outcome. And the technique I talk about in the book is called moving our horizons. We pick something to focus on, and then we move towards that. And as soon as you pick a horizon, you're creating for yourself a duration, pathway, outcome. And so a quick example would be in Navy SEAL training, for example. You spend hundreds of hours running around with big, heavy boats on your head. And in Hell Week, you're doing it all the time, right? And I remember it was during Hell Week. It was I don't know, god awful time, 3 a.m. or something. We're running on the beach with this boat, and I'm just miserable. Okay, and next to us is a sand berm. And I say to myself, you know what? I'm just going to focus on getting to the end of the sand berm. And what I realized I did in that moment without knowing it is I picked a horizon. I created a DPO. The duration was from now until the end of sand berm. The pathway was from here to end of sand berm, and the outcome was end of sand berm. As soon as I got to the end of that sand berm, that was a reward that I created for myself neurologically. I gave myself a dopamine reward, and I was able to come back out and pick a new horizon. And so the idea of these techniques and tools is we first must gain control of our physiology so that we can now ask specific questions about our environment. What do I know? What can I control? And begin to pick these horizons appropriately so we can start stepping through this stress, challenge, uncertainty, whatever that is. So that's a kind of a long answer to that question.
No, I love it. I love it because it's, I mean, like marathon runners or runners in general are
Mhm.
usually picking like, I'm going to run to that tree and then I'm going to run to the next tree. And then
Yeah,
you just continue pushing it back further and further
that's
because
right.
otherwise you're just, the only thing you're thinking about is the pain that you're going through
That's
during
right.
that moment.
It's,
And so,
it's it's quite literally the neurological equivalent to eating the elephant one bite at a time. Now, one of the
mm,
things we have to understand about this process and dopamine, because what you're doing is you're managing, you're basically creating yourself a dopamine reward system.
yeah.
Is that dopamine acts in a very interesting way, and dopamine's, by the way, a motivation chemical. It's not a reward chemical.
Yeah.
Dopamine says, "Hey, this is good. Keep doing this." What we have to do is we have to manage our horizons appropriately and pick meaningful horizons. What
Mm,
do I mean by that? I mean that horizons for each individual are going to be subjective to that individual. In other words, your horizon might be different from my horizon. And if you pick a horizon that's too far, you are going to run out of dopamine before you get there, which means you will likely quit.
mm,
If you pick a horizon too short, it's not going to be enough to get that reward from that accomplishment. So these horizons have to be subjective. They often differ based on the intensity of the environment. So in other words, at the moment of running on the beach, I could pick the end of the sandberm, but there were times in SEAL training where I remember just being freezing in the surf zone, for example, and I'm like, I'm going to count 5 waves.
mm.
That's my horizon. Or I'm going to take 5 breaths, or I'm going to wait to the next meal. So we're constantly modulating our horizons based on our own dopamine reward system, and that's very subjective. It's a subjective test. So marathon runners do this all the time. That's why they have mile markers, by the way,
Yeah.
on these marathons. But you can ask some marathon runners, and some of them will say, you know what, I never look at the mile marker until maybe mile 10 or maybe mile 15, right? Because they don't need it and they don't want it. That their first horizon might be 10 miles versus
Mhm.
1 mile. And so we just have to make sure we're managing that for ourselves and understand that others around us may be picking different horizons as well.
One favor to ask of you. Over 95% of the people that tune into this podcast are not yet subscribed. And whether it's your first time here or you are a regular listener of the show, I just ask that you hit that button. We've grown over 880% this past year, and I know we are destined to impact so many people in this year of 2025. And the way we're going to do that is by you hitting that subscribe button, you sharing it with a friend that you think will get value from the show, you leave a rating and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, you leave a comment, a like on this post, and that you get it out to more people because that is the way we're going to impact more and more people. And the way that I'm going to return the favor to you is by getting more and more guests on the show to help you expand your mind, question your beliefs, and really help you open your mind up to how good this life can really get. And I'm going to do that by having interviews and conversations with exceptional people. And it's just going to get better and better. And I hope that you stick along for the journey and then you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. I run a certain direction from my house. Let's say I go right.
Yeah,
And there was one day when I decided to go left because every time I go right, I know exactly when I hit a mile. When I
yeah,
turn left, I don't know where that mile is. And so I end up going over it without even thinking about it because I'm not really thinking about how far I'm going, kind of thing.
yeah,
To think about Andrew Huberman from the first book to the second one, you seem like you're getting really deep into neuroscience more and more the more that you have conversations with him.
yeah.
How did he kind of help you? Or like what did you take from him in writing this second book? What was different?
Well, so one of the things I recognize. So just the origin story. Andrew and I met back in 2017, and we met at this planning session. A mutual friend was trying to get together a group of high performing folks to do like a day of learning for some executives. And so he brought a bunch of us together just to talk, and that's where I met Andrew. David Goggins was there too, so I got to visit
Yep.
with David. So David and I were the two SEALs, but but Andrew and I really clicked off together because he was at the time running his Fear Lab
Hmm.
at Stanford, and he was fascinated with how we as Navy SEALs step through and manage fear. And so what we recognized was that we could start bringing together the tools and techniques that we quote do without even thinking about it, and what that means neuroscientifically. And I think the reason why Andrew has been so helpful, not only to me, but to the world at this point, is because he takes neuroscience and he can relate it to human behavior very effectively. And as soon as you can say, hey, I'm behaving this way, and here's neuroscientifically why, it clicks for everybody. I mean, it's very understandable, and B, it's repeatable and teachable, right? So I think for us, what we began to work on was this idea of, okay, what happens as we're stepping into uncertainty and fear and challenge and stress? What are those things that we do? And in my 21 years as a Navy SEAL and multiple combat deployments and all that stuff, I was able to say, well, listen, this is the way we do it. These are the things we do. And he was like, okay, neuroscientifically, what that means is this. And we basically started putting together these puzzle pieces. And that was certainly the impetus to the material in the second book. He and I talked a lot about attributes as well prior to that as well. And then we have a whole host of stuff we've talked about that we haven't even, or we worked on that we haven't, neither of us have published yet, which hopefully will come down the pipe even sooner. But yeah, but I think it's this idea that if I've always been fascinated in trying to articulate that which we do, but we just don't know how to describe, whether it's attributes or thinking, oh, what are those qualities? What, I don't know what, it's attributes, right? As soon as you articulate it. But if we can start articulating it and saying, okay, this is in fact what's happening, again, it can be repeated, it can be practiced, it can be trained, and now we're in business.
Yeah, the attributes was really fascinating to learn about from you because it's one of those things that I'm fascinated about in the sense of we're always looking for metrics that can be measured, things that we can see, things that we can point to.
Yeah.
Attributes are kind of innate in a sense. And I think for many people, but even with the attributes, the categories, it keeps getting bigger and bigger as the time goes on. So I'm curious how your perspective of attributes used to be when you first wrote the book and then even now, because it keeps expanding.
It does. I will say it has stopped expanding, at least for now, which is good. We're at 41 attributes, and we have an assessment tool. We want, again, I'm always open for more attributes if they come, or even less. But we're always trying to put it through the rigor. But I think we're pretty steady at 41. But I will, yes. When I wrote the book, I talked about 25. Now, admittedly, James, when I wrote the book, I knew there were more than 25 attributes, but I wanted to focus on the ones that I felt were more focused on optimal performance. And then B, you can't tell a publisher you're going to write about 41 attributes because they don't want 900-page books, right?
Yeah.
So that's why the list has expanded since the book. But the idea is these qualities are inherent, they're innate, they're inherent to our nature. You can see them in very small children's or in very small children, and then they're fairly elemental. In other words, they're kind of the basic qualities that add up to other things. So the example, because I get people saying all the time, like, "Hey, what about this? Is this an attribute?" And one person said, "Is self-awareness an attribute?" And I said, "Well, self-awareness, it seems like it could be, but if you put it through the test, right? I'm not sure if you can look at a kid who's like 1.5, and say they're self-aware. That's one
Right.
thing. You might not see it at that level, but also self-awareness to me is actually a combination of things, right? In other words, self-awareness is a combination of humility, which is an attribute, of confidence, which is an attribute, of discernment. There's a couple things that go into curiosity is certainly a component of self-awareness. So the kind of the test that we put, or the rigor we put through these things, has to pass that. And so as I get more comments or thoughts on, hey, is this an attribute, that attribute, I put it through those tests. And right now we're steady at 41 and 9 categories. We'll see if that changes, but that really has been the evolution of the list as it stands.
When you think of attributes from the beginning of your journey to now, as you said, it's expanded, I would say a good amount comparative to where it started at. Is there an attribute that you think holds highest for you, or something that has it changed over as you've added more of them to give kind of more context?
Well, that's another great question. I think that answer is highly subjective. I think attributes for everybody are different. I won't gaff off the question though, and I'll say that the one that's probably the most I've focused the most on is in fact compartmentalization, because
Right.
compartmentalization is what that second book is about. Moving horizons and DPOing is basically compartmentalization explained. And as an attribute, we can practice that attribute through these techniques and tools that I talk about in Masters of Uncertainty. So that's certainly always been, and I've always been very adamant about the fact that you can't be a Navy SEAL without a really healthy amount of compartmentalization. I would say that showing up to day one of SEAL training, if you don't have enough compartmentalization, just showing up to the beaches of SEAL training day one, you're not going to make it through. If you have enough and you actually make it through, then you just hyper develop that as you go through a career. And so that's always been an important one. And I think, the grit attributes always hold a special place for me. That's courage, adaptability, perseverance, resilience, because I do think that ultimately, while I wouldn't put a ranking on any of these attributes, I think as human beings in our human experience, if we don't have an semblance of those 4, we're going to have a rough go of it. We really are. Now, we all, like I say, all of us have all the attributes, but if we're low on those 4, it's going to be a little bit of a rough ride. So I think those are actually quite important when we look at the list of all 41.
For a lot of people, they have this belief that they just can't. Like
Yeah.
there is no spectrum of it. I am just not someone that can do that.
Yeah.
What are people misunderstanding? Where are people going wrong when it comes to it?
They're misunderstanding the fact that they probably already have compartmentalized at certain parts of their lives. This is a very human thing. Well, we all do it to some degree. Now, some of us can't do it as expertly as others. The fact is, every single one of us can probably think of a story where something was happening around us and we just had to stop, focus on something, block out everything else, and make that happen for whatever short time frame. Even if it's someone saying, you know what, I just stopped and I took 5 breaths. That's compartmentalization. I mean, we all do that. That's moving our horizons. That's basically focusing on something and blocking out everything else. So I believe everybody can come up with an example of how they've compartmentalized. And I think a lot of us, we actually have experiences in life that we don't recognize are practicing compartmentalization, but it in fact is. I always tell the story, I was growing up, my dad did not like to use central heating in the house. He just didn't like it. So we had a fireplace, and a coal stove downstairs. So we did fires.
Hmm.
And so he would get cords of wood delivered to our driveway every season. They were huge piles of wood. And it was my and my brother's job to move that wood up to the front of the house and stack it. Now, we had 2 ways we could do that. We could go the short way, which was going up some stairs, and then you're right there. But to do that, you couldn't use a wheelbarrow. You just had to basically carry a load. So it would take a lot longer.
Yeah.
Or you could do the long way where you could take a wheelbarrow all the way around the house up this little hill and then kind of go to the back way. Now, we always chose the wheelbarrow route because you could just get more done. But I remember every time we had to move wood, my brother and I would basically attack that pile, and we would never look at the whole pile. We would just look at one load, we do that. Then we do another load, we do that. We do another load. We just do load after load after load. And after a while, we'd say, "Oh, wait, we're almost done," right? But we were quite literally, as I look back in retrospect, we were quite literally compartmentalizing that task, because to look at the whole pile was way too much, right? And so, I mean, and a lot of us have stories of athletics where they've compartmentalized, whether it be rowing or running or whatever, or biking. But I think swimming. I think all of us can probably dig back a little bit and say, you know what, I actually have compartmentalized. Let me think about what I was doing and just repeat.
Talking about your dad, you guys used to drive bikes to practice instead of him driving you as well. And I think one of the things about attributes that I find fascinating, and I'm curious about, because attributes versus skills is one of the things that I want to dive into. But I feel as though your upbringing has to have some kind of impact on the attributes that you adapt and or you mimic, maybe
Yeah.
in some way. How does your upbringing have a impact on the attributes that you maybe seemingly have a better handle on or are stronger in, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it does, and I think attributes. I've always purported that attributes are both nature and nurture. So we come into this world with some predispositions in terms of where our attributes fall, but environment certainly has an impact. And what we have to recognize, and this is something Huberman has talked about a lot, is that from birth to about 22 or 23, our frontal lobes are still forming.
Mhm.
We are absolute sponges in terms of our brain development and our neuroplasticity, and so our experiences can affect our attribute development quite majorly. I mean, or they can't, or they won't. I mean, it's not for certain, but I do think things like riding our bikes to practice. I mean, you ride your bike with your football gear on, 5 or 6 miles to practice, and you're going up these hills. That's an exercise in compartmentalization. I mean, it really is. So you are and grit. In terms of the perseverance and all that stuff. So I do think our environments do have a huge say in our attribute development, but we just also have to recognize that sometimes they may not. I mean, you may have a kid who's what we call a military brat, right? Their parents are in the military, they're moving every 2 years, and that kid may show up on this planet with low adaptability, but through moving every 2 years, develop a really good high level of adaptability. That is a possibility, right? There's also a possibility that that kid never develops their adaptability, and that whole endeavor just sucks the whole way through, right? They never like it. They never. So it's just not. We have to understand that it's not a black and white thing. There's a gray area, but the development part of our lives, especially specifically that first portion of life, is very important. It's why actually when we get reach outs from schools, elementary and middle schools and some high schools, and I have told them, I said, listen, I'm and in fact we're working with some schools to help them with an attributes curriculum. But
Nice.
one of the things I'm adamant about is I'm not gonna give these kids the assessment. I don't want these kids to label themselves or
Yeah.
feel like they are a certain level of these things. I want them to learn about these things so they can just explore and figure out what they mean. But labeling, that shouldn't happen until a little bit later.
Labeling is one of the things you talk a bit about identity in the new book as well, and
Yeah.
I find identity is one of the most fascinating things that we go through this life because most people are unaware of the identity that they take on for themselves, and so
Yeah.
they play out that as that is who I am.
Yes.
What did you learn about identity doing the research for this new book that you maybe didn't know before?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been fascinated with identity, by the way, and I think part of it's because I'm a twin, and growing up as a twin, an identical twin, you almost feel like you don't have an identity because you're always with somebody else.
Right.
You're always when people look at you or talk to you or even have you in their experience, it's always you and someone else. It's never just you. And I
Yeah.
don't say that in a pouty way. It's just I think that's one of the reasons why I've always been so fascinated with the topic. And so I think just to give the listeners a review on this, or just my kind of important 10 cents, and that is I truly believe and have experienced that the two most powerful words in the human language are the words I am, because whatever you put after those words, you actually your whole being steers to that,
Hmm.
because it's just if you develop, it's how you behave. And so what we have to recognize is that we actually slap on a bunch of I ams as we go through life. There's identities, and some of them can be pretty powerful, and some of them can be somewhat benign. I mean, whether I went to this high school. I played lacrosse. I'm a Navy SEAL. I'm a
Hmm.
husband. I'm a father. I'm a Metallica fan. I'm a Harley guy. Whatever that is. But whatever those I ams are, whatever those identities are, they all come with some rules and conditions that define the behavior for that identity. And what
Hmm.
we have to recognize is our behavior will skew towards that. I mean, if you're a rabid Eagles fan, you're going to hate Kansas City. At least, well, now they don't, but at least up until last night, they were Kansas City's haters, right? And their behavior skewed to that. And so we have to recognize that unconsciously, when we're behaving, especially during stress, challenge, and uncertainty, because that's really where I'm really fascinated, is who we are at our most raw. Because when stress, challenge, and uncertainty are hitting us and we're kind of steeped in chaos, that's when the most raw comes out. That like we're acting at our most raw. So what's driving that behavior? Obviously, attributes are driving that behavior, but those identities that we're carrying with us and those identities we prioritize are in fact shaping our behavior. And this is why you get people who sometimes act out and they do things and afterwards like I didn't know what I was doing, right? So the sports fan who beats the hell out of another opposing sports fan and then afterwards says I was kind of caught up in the moment, I didn't know what I was doing. That's an example of being caught in an identity that you just are not aware of, right? And so in when you go to war, my Navy SEAL identity was predominant, right? That's where I led with. That's what we all had to lead with. But sometimes the environment would shift, and my husband and father identity would come out, right? And I'd have to behave a little bit differently because that was the identity. And so all this to say, we have to begin to be very, I think, diligent about recognizing the identities we've stacked for
Hmm.
ourselves, whatever those might be. Because I joke in the book, even hating something, even being a Nickelback hater, is an identity, right? I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
because it's going to shape your behavior. So be honest about that. See if you can explore those, and then start to understand how you prioritize those identities in your behavior. Some are going to be benign, others are going to be very powerful. And whatever those powerful ones, those may be very helpful in certain environments, but they may not be very helpful in certain environments. I can't carry my Navy SEAL identity into regular everyday life walking
Mhm.
around as a civilian. It's just not going to be appropriate. So you have to be able to modulate those and be aware. And I think part of this awareness is in fact the secret to success in any stress, challenge, and uncertainty.
Okay, so we're gonna go deep here because this is something that, when it comes to identity, I think of, say, Navy SEALs, like you say, when you're going through buds and people think they're this kind of person, and then they
Yeah.
get into it and they realize that they're not who they thought they were in the midst of it, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
a lot of people are playing the role of the identity that they think they are, and then the raw them comes out in the situations where uncertainty plays. But let's say someone has a lot of evidence to reinforce why they believe they're this kind of person and that is their identity. Maybe an unconfident person. They don't believe they're a confident person and they don't believe their attribute really aligns with that. How
Yeah.
can someone take on a new identity? Does it just have to come through providing new evidence, or where do you think that comes from?
Yeah, I think. Oh boy, that's a good one. I think that we one of the superpowers we have as human beings is the ability to make decisions. And when you
Mhm.
make a decision, decide comes from this Latin word that means to cut off all possibility, right? So you're basically deciding to do something to go a certain path. And so while I will certainly concede that we can be in a moment in our life where we have an identity of I'm not confident or I'm not this or whatever, it could be a discouraging or a detrimental identity. we always have the ability to make a different decision, and I think, I say this to people now, and I said it when I was a SEAL, but when I was a younger man and I wanted to be a Navy SEAL, I wasn't a SEAL yet. I was in college. I was still working to get there. I would say to myself over and over, I am a Navy SEAL. I am a Navy SEAL. I am a Navy SEAL, right? Because the idea was to get that inculcated into my system, and drive my behavior. And I think we have a real superpower as human beings to allow for our intent to drive our behavior. And Huberman's talks about this idea that sometimes even lying to ourselves works
Yeah.
because we're setting that intent in our brain. And so I would say anybody who's struggling with an identity that they think they have that is either destructive or not helpful, make a different decision. Decide to be something else. I'm a big proponent of writing that down. Don't
Mhm.
just say it in your head, but write down what that limiting belief is, and then write down your new decision, and then stick to that and repeat that if you need to. But we can transform ourselves, any one of us, from one identity to another identity. It may not be rapid, but it could be. I mean, it really could be rapid. I mean, you're young right now, so I'm assuming you don't have kids, but as soon as you become a mother or a father, your identity changes in an instant, and it's
Yeah.
really weird. Almost every parent will agree that that baby pops out. You hold that baby for the very first time, and your whole identity changes.
Mhm.
You are now a father or a mother, and man, it's a very powerful. It's why it moves you so much. So it can change quite rapidly as well. But I think it's all about making that decision.
Yeah, a friend of mine just had a baby, and he said that as soon as he has had his son in his hands, he goes, "I feel like I've always been a father," and so it
Yes.
makes so much sense, right? Like he feels
Yeah.
like he's never not been a father, and it's funny how that shifts like that. I had a Derek Sivers on who wrote plenty of books behind me. He wrote a book actually recently called "Useful Not True," and
Oh,
it talks similar to what you're talking about with Andrew Huberman in the sense that it doesn't have to be necessarily true, but if it's useful for you, take
yeah.
on that belief and
Yeah.
then create actions or take actions in accordance to that kind of person. And eventually you're going to become that kind of person. But
Yeah.
a lot of us are just taking action based on the person we see ourselves as. It's not really the person that we want to be. And that's a difficult thing. And when you talk about prioritization too, I think that's one of the difficult things. When I think of Navy SEALs, I think of athletes in the sense that when an athlete retires or a Navy SEAL retires, who am I anymore?
Right.
Like where do I go? Who am I as a person? And how do you not get too attached to your identity and still allow yourself to be elusive and allowing yourself to evolve as a person?
Yeah, I think part of the trick is to understand what other identities you carry. Okay, so I think for me and for a lot of the Navy SEALs who are my buddies who had healthy transitions, many of them are fathers and husbands. My husband father identity was always as powerful as my
Yeah.
Navy SEAL identity. And so when the Navy SEAL identity went away, I still had that to fall back on. I wasn't, there was certainly a dearth in terms of, well, I'm not that anymore. And again, Navy SEALs are different than, say, Marines. I mean, Marines really have this once a Marine, always a Marine. It's really fantastic. It's a fantastic culture that they have. But the Navy SEAL culture is different. The Navy SEAL culture is really earn your trident every day. And as soon as you take off that trident, you're not earning it every day. So we as Navy SEALs are now former Navy jokes like I'm not a Navy SEAL anymore. I'm a former Navy SEAL.
Yeah.
That comes with it a dearth in that identity. But I think to be able to have maybe something to fall back on and have it very powerful,
Mhm.
and then B, I think to make a decision to build a new identity. For me, it was like, okay, well, I have the husband and father thing. That's fine. I'm going to build a new one, an author, an
Mhm.
entrepreneur, a writer, whatever that is. And I'm still working on it. And I think those are new mountains people can climb, and begin to formulate a new. We can formulate any identity we want. It just takes a decision. And I would just want to go back to one thing you said because I think it's important in terms of the ability to decide on something, even if it doesn't seem true, but it's useful. There's a neurological reason for this. And the neurological reason is because, like I said, our brains are question answering machines. Our brains are constantly interrogating our environment. And so, one of the things we talk about with people is to just change the quality of your questions because you change your questions, you change what your brain focuses on.
Mhm.
Wherever your brain focuses is where it directs your behavior. This is proven out physiologically too. The example I'll use it in the SEALs, depending on what teams you go to, you get to go to a bunch of driving schools. And so I got to go. I love driving. I like driving anything, whether it's a forklift, a boat, a car, motorcycles. I love driving everything. So every driving school I could sign up for, I did. So I went to a bunch of driving and racing schools. And when you go to a racing school, one of the first things they tell you is they get you in the car and they say, okay, we're going to learn how to get out of a spin, when the car gets out of control. They say, when you're in a spin, when the car gets out of control, do not stare at the wall because if you stare at the wall, you're going to hit the wall. Okay, you need to stare. You need to turn and try to stare at where you want to go. So
Mm,
if the car is pointing this way towards the wall, your head is just straining, looking at where you want to go, and your body begins to react.
yeah.
Same goes with our brain. Same goes with our thoughts. If we deliberately direct our thoughts along a certain path, our body, our brain, our physiology is going to start going that direction. So this is a real important thing for people to remember. If you think crummy, disruptive, destructive thoughts, that is where your body and your physiology is going to go, whether it's true or not. Okay. If you think empowering, growth inducing, positive thinking, whether it's true or not, your body is going to start directing that way. And so it's really important to maintain, again, control of our conscious thinking.
100%. I've said this so many times on the podcast. My life changed when I stopped asking, why is this happening to me and how is this happening for me?
Yeah. Yes, that's
You,
right.
you're going to get a different answer, but we're
Yes.
never taught to ask those kind of questions. I mean, I feel for so many people, they're in a such destructive place in their life because they're asking the wrong questions, but no one ever told them to ask better questions, nor
100%.
the questions to ask. Now that you're out of SEALs and you're coaching and you're writing and you're speaking, so many other things, do you have questions that you often ask yourself when you maybe don't feel as great as you'd like to?
Oh, absolutely. I use the technique all the time, and again, it's hard to give examples because the situations are always
Of
subjective.
course.
But I tell
Yeah.
people this: I said, listen, if you are in absence of what question to ask in the moment, you can't think of it. Just ask a simple one. Say, "What's a better question right now?"
Mm.
And if you ask, "What's a better question right now?" You're going to come up with some better questions.
Yeah, yeah.
And so now, if you're even worse off and you can't even get that out of your head, one that I always default to is, "What am I grateful for right
Mm.
now?" Because gratitude is one of the most powerful human emotions, physiologically and neurobiologically. And so just to be able to get yourself to a place of gratitude is going to shift your state and allow you to ask better questions. So if you can't even ask what's a better question right now, just say, okay, what am I grateful for? And really answer that honestly and start feeling that gratitude, and then you'll be able to step up your game.
It's incredible. Yeah, Tony Robbins always talks about how what you focus on is a life that you're living out, right? At
Yeah.
the end of the
Yeah.
day. Like there's always negative in the world and there's always positive in the world. Whatever you look for, that's what you're going to get more of. And yeah, I think that's fascinating. That's a really really empowering way to think about it as well. One thing that I find really fascinating about the SEALs is I think you've spoke about it in other podcasts as well. You'll be in the sky and people are sleeping as they're going to
Yeah.
wherever you're going. And it makes sense when you think about it, optimal versus peak performance kind of thing. But I feel for a lot of people, say you're about to go on stage or something like that, it can be a completely different scenario, but you're feeling physiologically the same kind of experience, fear, whatever's coming up for you.
Yeah.
What is it about the SEALs? Like, how do you practice? We've talked a little bit about breath work, but is there anything else that comes up for you when you think of allowing yourself to be grounded in the moment? Because you guys seem to be some of the most present individuals on
Yeah.
the planet, but I would assume that most people don't think of you that way. Probably you're thinking in advance.
No, it's true. And I'm going to go back to the basics, which is compartmentalization and shifting and moving horizons. One of the things you realize when you become hyper proficient at this ability, you recognize that there's no value in worrying about that which you can't control. And in fact, to worry about that which you can't control is actually very neurologically expensive in terms of energy. It's very energy expensive, neurologically at least. And so you're spending a lot of your energy worrying about shit you can't control, whether it's past or future. And I think what you recognize and you learn very quickly in the SEAL teams is that you're going to plan ahead, right? You're going to say, okay, I have a mission coming up. We have 5 different phases. I'm going to look at each phase and say, okay, well, during this phase we may have this or this. These 2 or 3 things may happen. Okay, if this happens, we'll do this. If this happens, but we're not going to overplan. We're not going to have paralysis through analysis. And then we're going to say to a certain point, okay, I can't predict everything. So I'm just going to, if something happens, I'll figure it out when I'm there. And then we let it go and we start focusing on the moment. And so when you're in a helicopter flying into combat and guys are napping, it means the guys, yeah, there's stuff coming, but I can't control anything right now. I've plans. I'm ready. I'm just going to rest. I'm going to relax. I'm going to be present. A better example of this, I was with a bunch of my buddies who I went to war with and served with, and we were talking about a mission profile where we do high altitude, high opening parachute operations. And so again, just for the audience, you have high altitude for years. When it comes to military free fall, there was halo jumping, right? High altitude, low opening, where you jump out at like 20,000 feet and you fall till about 2,500 feet and you pull your chute. And it was a kind of a stealthy way to insert into an area. until some crazy dude said, you know what, why don't we just jump out at 20,000 feet and then immediately pull our parachute, and then we can fly our parachutes to a nice long distance landing zone somewhere, and it's even more stealthy, right? And so this is something we would do constantly. It was a mission profile, and you know, you're flying to a what's called an unknown DZ. That's basically you're looking at a map and saying, hey, that looks like a good place to land, but you have no idea, there could be boulders, right? So, and then you're landing, and then you're going to a target, you're doing a target, all that stuff. So anyway, all this to say, I was having lunch with a couple of my buddies, and we were talking about this, and we were talking about one particular mission where it was a huge mission. We were doing a hey-ho, so going out at 20,000 and flying to an unknown DZ, and there was going to be a patrol in, and a huge target, and all that stuff. So massive thing. And my buddy and I, or my buddies were all talking, and one of the guys says, hey, you know, it's funny because when that ramp opened up, there was only one thing I was thinking. And we were like, what's that? He was like, nail the exit. You know, and it's because if you don't jump out of that plane in a stable position, you're not gonna be able to pull your chute, and the chute's not gonna open properly. So first you have to nail the exit. And once you nail the exit, you say, okay, pull my parachute, pull that. Okay, get on heading. Okay, do that. Right. So even in those moments with all this in front of us, okay, we are focused on what I need to accomplish right now, and then I'll step through it. And I think this is a lesson in life. We have to, again, this does not negate or replace good planning. Good planning is necessary because it helps you kind of understand and actually gives some relief to you having to figure it out along the way. It's like, well, I've already planned for that one, so it happens. But we also have to recognize is SEALs never spend energy worrying about shit that they can't control, right? We just don't. You know, we just say, hey, listen, I'll get there when I get there, but I'm not gonna spend my energy doing that. And that is it's an amazing ability in any facet of life, as long as you've done at least some planning. I'm never a supporter of just going in cold, right? But again, some people are good at it. Who knows? But I think this is what we have to think about, and this is where we have to really manage our energy so that we're not in the moment. If I'm about to give a speech, because I didn't like speaking, I got nervous before it when I first started. But I said to myself, you know, I'm not going to worry about that. I mean, I've rehearsed, I know my stuff. I'll worry about speaking when I get up and speak. I'm not going to worry about the crowd. I'm just going to focus on what I need to focus on, you know, and that really helps in every facet of life.
Yeah, I mean, preparation doesn't have to lead to overthinking or anxiety, and it's I think a really helpful thing for people to hear that, because I think our brains are prediction making machines. I mean, we're always predicting what's next, what's the worst thing that can happen.
Yeah.
And so just reminding people of that is really helpful. With this new book, I mean, authors take years, like months out of their life to dedicate so much time to learning a specific skill or talking about a specific thing. With this new book, was there anything, I guess, unexpected in the research or anything that you came up across that maybe you didn't think was going to show up when you first started writing?
But, you know, the writing process is always fun and interesting because I learn a lot when I'm writing, and I'm the type of person who I love collaborating. So I work with people, and I just talk through ideas. And so as I write, as I talk through ideas, new insights come to the fore. And I think that this book was no different. I think a lot of meat was kind of sussed out during the writing process. You know, and again, this is a good kind of tip for anybody who's interested in writing a book about anything. Is like, okay, just get started. All right, get started, and then as you start, you will begin to figure it out along the way, and you'll get new ideas. And I'm a big believer in the fact that if you have an idea, get it down on paper, because then it clears your brain for other new ideas. You know? So I think, while I probably couldn't pinpoint a single thing, for me, the writing process always involves some very beautiful discovery along the way. Now, some of that discovery will be meaningful and it'll end up in the book. Some of it will fall by the wayside, just doesn't fit. And others just, you know, sometimes it's just nonsense, but you just have to sort it all out. So yeah, I think any type of creative endeavor is going to allow for, and one of the gifts is discovery along the way. So
when you're dedicating so much time to a book and writing stuff, most people are going to have, like you said, the publisher's not going to want 900 pages, so you're going to have to shorten a lot of things down anyway. Was there anything, when you were shortening it down, was there anything that you wish you could have added, or anything that was
well, so it's interesting. In the second book, you know, the first book, The Attributes, it's about, I think it's about 70,000 words, which translates to about almost 200 pages, you know. And I'm very proud of that book, and I'm very proud of the way it's written. However, I made a deliberate decision on the second one that I wanted to write a shorter book. This second one is about 28,000 words. It's deliberately short. I wanted to write it more in a handbook type style,
Mm.
so that someone could really take it, read it quite quickly. I put at every chapter, there's, okay, here's key points you can take away, so that people can really use it as a guidebook versus just a good read. So no, I didn't really find myself editing the second one, because I went in with this idea that I'm going to make it really tight to begin with, and that was the decision. But certainly with the first one, there were some things that hit the cutting room floor on that one that I was like, oh, I'm sorry to lose that, but it's not fitting, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's cool to think about because I mean, I definitely plan to write books in the future. I've had so many authors on the podcast. When you're dedicating so much time to something, you become obsessed with it in some
Yeah,
sense, right? I mean, you have to be so obsessed with it. And identity seems to be one of those things for this new book that was just like you said, you're so passionate about, excited about.
yeah.
From the books that you've written, from this one to the last one, even was there something that a different way that you approached writing? And I don't mean in the sense of the way that you write, but more so in I guess what you wanted to put into the book. Like you said, you wanted to shorten it down.
Yeah.
What was the purpose behind that?
Well, the purpose was because I know, and I just know, I know as a reader, sometimes people they'll love a book, but it's hard for people to finish a book unless you're
Yeah,
an avid reader and
yeah,
and
yeah,
you dedicated time. Like I try, like every night I read. You know, before I go to bed I read. And I made that decision about a year and a half ago, and now I'm getting through books, right? But before I made that decision, it would take me forever to get through a book, you know, and a lot of times I get through a book maybe halfway, and it was like, oh, that's cool, but then I put it down and never finish it. So I know, even friends of mine who love my book, I know they haven't read the whole thing. It's just a long book, right? So,
right,
and I get it, you know, because
yeah,
and so I think I wanted to be quite deliberate in the second one, so that it didn't feel as much like a book. It felt more like a handbook, you know,
mhm,
because it feels small, it feels quick, and that was really the psychology I went in with. But again, it's really going to be up to someone as an author themselves on how they want to design that. I just know, unless it's like a really cool, interesting fiction page turner, it's tough for people to finish books. It just really is.
yeah. You don't see many 400-page books anymore. I
Yeah,
mean,
you don't.
I don't see them often either.
Yeah, especially nonfiction. I mean, nonfiction, which is super interesting. I mean, it's just tough sometimes. Again, unless you are someone who has dedicated time, and or audiobooks help and things like that, and you have drive
Yeah,
time
yeah,
and things like that, it's difficult. And I get it. I don't blame anybody. So
yeah. I think of Tim Ferriss. I haven't seen a book the size of the 4 Hour Work Week since the 4 Hour
yeah,
Week,
yeah,
probably.
yeah.
It's definitely funny to think about. I mean, one thing that I love asking people is there's no shortcuts in life for sure, but there are questions that we can ask people to get more of an insight on how we can approach life through a different perspective. Is there anything that I don't want to look through this through the lens of regret, but is there anything that you spent a lot of time on, whether that mental time or physical things that you did, not that you wish you hadn't, but maybe you spent a
Yeah.
little too much time on?
Let's see. That's you know, I always I because I always I honor the process itself. It's difficult for me to answer because I've always felt like everything fell into place properly, and the work involved was the work
Yeah.
involved. So it's, but I don't want to, again, I don't want to gaff off the question. I would say this. I would say that, you know, like I said, in terms of writing, people who are interested in writing, just start writing, you know, and you have to find your own creative space. So one of the things I did have to figure out was my writing style, and my
Mm,
writing style is one that I talk about the attributes. So in the 41 attributes, there's the attribute of creativity and there's the attribute of innovativeness. Okay,
mhm,
now these are two separate attributes. People often think of them as the same, but they're actually distinct. Creativity is this ability to bring into existence something that otherwise didn't exist. Okay, that's like the blank sheet of paper I'm going to write on it. It's the lump of clay I'm going to sculpt, or the canvas I'm just going to paint. Innovativeness is the ability to take something currently or already in existence and make it better. Okay, so why does this matter? It's because you can have someone who's high creativity, low innovativeness, and in fact, a lot of creatives will classify themselves this way. They'll be like, okay, listen, don't just give me space and I will create. If you say, hey, do like make this pen better, like that's not what I do. Like just give me the space, I'll create. Right? There are other people who are higher on innovativeness and lower on creativity. I'm in fact higher on innovativeness than I am on creativity. And so how that manifested in my writing was, for me, the most difficult part was staring at that blank screen, that cursor blinking at me, right? It was very hard for me to get stuff on the page. And what I recognized and what I realized about myself is, hey, the magic happens when I'm in the editing process.
Mm.
So I just began, my strategy was I just began to write. And it could have been utter nonsense. Like just start writing a story that's in my head, but just get something on the paper. Because as soon as I got clicked in, and I had some words on the page, the editing process took over. I could now innovate versus have to create from nothing. And so I think for anybody who's interested in that type of endeavor, just start figuring out your style, because you may get discouraged because you're seeing that blank sheet of paper and you're like, I don't know what to say. Well, okay, just start saying anything and see what happens. My buddy Stephen Kotler, who's written a bunch of great books, he writes every single morning. He's a prolific writer.
Yeah.
And it's because he writes every single morning. He just does it. It's kind of like Jerry Seinfeld, who writes jokes every morning. He has writing time where he sits down and he writes. And even if he's there for a half hour, he almost does nothing. He still dedicates that time. So I'm not saying you have to be that stringent, but I was saying that if you're interested, put in the time.
It's a bias towards action. That's it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, regardless if you're trying to write or whatever it is, and anything in life, just get acting instead of waiting on it. I have two more questions for you.
Yeah, please.
One is, when people think of Navy SEALs, I think of them as like the hardest individuals on the planet. Like, I remember when I started drinking black coffee, I used to think I had to be a Navy SEAL to drink black coffee. Like, you're crazy. Now I drink it every single morning, and it's just become something I enjoy. But what do you think most people misunderstand about being a Navy SEAL? I mean, 21 years.
Yes.
What do they think?
Well, first of all, they think we all are like mean and are huge and muscular. So Jocko's a friend of mine, and Jocko and I joke, is like Jocko, but we joke because not like very few SEALs look like Jocko.
Right.
Like, I think Jocko looks like what most people think Navy SEAls look like. Okay.
Yeah.
And certainly there are some that look like that, but for the most part, you wouldn't be able to pick a SEAL out of the crowd unless you kind of knew what you're looking for. I can pick them out of the crowd every day. But because I know what I'm looking for. But we are just, most guys, and this goes for all Spec Ops, whether it's SEALs or Delta or Rangers or whatever, or SF, Green Berets, fairly normal looking guys. I mean, certainly in shape, but it's hard sometimes to tell. They're not, and they're usually quite social. They're nice. They're kind of, they're not mean, and it's just normal people. A lot of people who talk to me, they say, I met these Navy SEALs, and it's like, I couldn't believe they were Navy SEALs. Like, okay, well, that's kind of a compliment, right? So
yeah.
I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is, whether it's SEALs or any Spec Ops, incredibly smart people. These are guys who, a lot of them, I mean, there are a lot of the enlisted guys who already have college degrees. Not that college degree, means that you know a lot more, but these are highly intelligent folks, and they think, and they are designed, and for the most part, to really do a job that's very complex and very unique and very special. And so the intelligence level is something that I've always enjoyed. I always enjoyed being part of. But yeah, it's not like Hollywood and TV where it's all explosions and gunfire and bullets and blood. And most of our missions were bloodless and bulletless. Most of the time, we were endeavoring to be like ghosts. We go in, go out, no one ever knows we're there. That's what was sexy to us. But Hollywood and TV, they need the drama. So you're gonna get movies made about all the missions, that, because bad shit happens, certainly. But for the most part, it's not that.
Yeah. It's yeah. I mean, like I said, about the black coffee thing, I used to think that for so long. It's
Me too, by the way. I've now drank black coffee for years, and I love it. I really do. Yeah. So.
People think I'm crazy. Yeah.
It's also, by the way, James, it's so easy. I mean, you go everywhere. Like, I'm on the airplane. It's like, oh, just give me black coffee. You don't have to say, oh, I want one cream, one sugar. It's just, black. It's easy.
Easy, no calories. You feel lighter. It's just, it's become I probably drink too much of it if I'm honest.
Me too.
Last question I ask every guest. What belief are you currently unlearning?
Ooh, that's a great one. So I have a ritual. I have a morning ritual where I actually, every morning, I try to think about a limiting belief I may have. And if I can think of it, I write it down. And then I say, okay, what's a new belief? What's the new decision I'm going to make? And I write down a completely new decision. And then after that, I put some evidence for it. I say, what's the evidence of that? So while I won't go specifically into all the things I'm writing down, but over the course of, and every morning I don't have something, right?
Yeah.
I mean, but I have a list now of maybe 10 that I've collected over the last several weeks. And I'll reread those and say, okay, is this a belief that is limiting for me? So again, I won't gap off the question. I'm trying to improve my relationship with social media. Okay, it's something that I avoided. As a SEAL, you have no interest in doing it, but you need to do it when you're in the business of writing books and building a business. So So my limiting, my belief around social media has, I admittedly, been limiting. And I've made a decision to now look at it in a positive, optimistic way. So we're doing better on that, and I'll let you know how it's going.
I hear you on that. There's some days where I want to record 100 podcasts, and the next day I don't want to be on social media for the next year.
Yeah,
So
that's right. Yeah.
I definitely feel you on that. Of course, the link to your book and all your socials will be in the show notes below. But is there anywhere you'd like to direct people?
Yeah, I mean, again, theattributes.com is where you can find everything. All the stuff we do, you can check out the new book as well. So our assessment tool, you can check that out. So theattributes.com, and even my handle, my Instagram and LinkedIn stuff is on there too. So if there's a one-stop shop, it's that.
Thank you, Rich.
Yeah, thank you, James.